Hey YouTube, welcome back to my channel. My name is Dr. Daniel Kaplan, and my mission is to make psychology accessible to all. In today's video, we're going to talk all about schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is one of the psychotic disorders that we talk about. And it's probably one of the most popularized in media, but also misrepresented in pop culture conditions. So what I'd like to do is try and give you, the audience, a better sense of what is schizophrenia, what are the criteria in order to diagnose schizophrenia, and what are some of the life course issues related to schizophrenia. So if you like what you hear, give me a big thumbs up, click the subscribe notifications tab, write in the comments any questions or comments or reactions you might have. But without further ado, let's talk about schizophrenia. So I think a good starting point is to try and define the terms psychosis, right? Because one of the myths about mental illness is that if you have mental illness, that means that you're psychotic. And that's not true. Only a select minority of conditions involve psychosis. So what is psychosis? Psychosis is a state defined by loss of contact with reality. So this could be that they're having hallucinations or delusions, which are either false sensory perceptual experiences, delusions or false beliefs, and their ability to respond to the environment is impacted by this, of course. So psychosis can occur from many different things. It can be induced by drugs of abuse, such as cocaine. In an earlier video, I mentioned the concept of a cocaine-induced psychotic disorder. It could also be caused by some form of brain injury, but most psychotic conditions appear to be some form of schizophrenia. So let's try and talk about, well, what is schizophrenia? Schizophrenia affects 1 out of 100 people in the world. So the rates are about 1%, which I also think is telling because the vast majority, again, of people with mental illness are non-psychotic, right? In terms of the United States, we have over 2.5 million people who currently have the diagnosis, and trying to address schizophrenia costs significant financial and emotional costs. So whether it be to treat, whether it be to address when a person engages in self-harm, whether it be to ensure that there are services in the community, it is very, very costly financially, but also emotionally, when you think about both the person who's struggling with schizophrenia and having to figure out what's going on inside, and then the families around. So sufferers do have greater risk of suicide and other, illnesses. So schizophrenia occurs across the board. It occurs in all socioeconomic statuses, but we do see in lower socioeconomic status that there is higher rates of diagnosis. So there is this theory called the downward drift hypothesis, which suggests that the stress of poverty is inducing this disorder at greater rates. And if you've been watching my series on mental health, I keep saying stress is a universal trigger to mental illness, right? So stress is a factor. And so another mindset is that the disorder causes victims who previously had higher socioeconomic statuses to drop into lower socioeconomic statuses as well. So these are kind of explanations for why a person might develop schizophrenia. In terms of gender differences, it's fairly evenly divided relative to males and females. We do see that the age of onset is slightly earlier for males relative to females, with the average age of onset being 21 for males and 27 for females. In terms of relationship status, we see that, again, 3% of people who are divorced or separated have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, 2% of single people, and 1% of married people. And there's a question as to whether marital problems cause the schizophrenia, meaning that that's the stress factor that causes the psychotic break, or whether or not the psychotic break causes the marital problems. So it's kind of the chicken egg issue that we don't have a good answer. Now, if we're going to look at the DSM-5 criteria, in order to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, you need 6 months or longer of symptoms. Now, I'll explain what I mean, because on the top of the slide, it sounds like it's 1 month, but it is a chronic condition, which means you need 6 months or longer, where you display 2 or more of the following features: delusions, which were false beliefs; hallucinations, perceptual disturbances; disorganized speech, we'll get into this; abnormal motor activity, such as catatonia; and then some negative features. And at least one of the individual symptoms has to be either delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech, right? So at least one of them. And this person, as a function of having the schizophrenia, has functioned poorly in many aspects of their life. And beyond this 1 month, here's the catcher: individuals have to display at least some degree of impaired functioning for an additional 5 months. So according to DSM-5, you need that first month plus 5 additional months. Now, in practicality, you're going to see it longer than 6 months anyway, but this is the threshold. So when we try and create a clinical picture of, well, what does schizophrenia look like, it varies. The symptoms, triggers, and course of schizophrenia looks different from person to person. So some clinicians have argued that schizophrenia is actually a group of separate disorders or distinct disorders with some common features. But, well, what are these common features that we look at? We look at positive symptoms, negative symptoms, and psychomotor symptoms, right? So let's talk about positive symptoms, right? So when we say positive in terms of schizophrenia, we're not suggesting that positive is good, right? This is an experience that's added to your reality relative to another person. So these are pathological excesses, right? So things like delusions, right? Delusions are not just false belief, but the delusions are to the point where they're incontrovertible, right? You cannot argue against this issue. So if I were to have a delusion of grandeur, for example, I might think that I am Napoleon, right? And if I said I am Napoleon, well, you could disprove I'm Napoleon because A, I'm not from France, don't speak the language, not born in that time period. There's so many reasons why that is a false belief, but it doesn't stick. There's a tenacity of the delusion when it comes to people with schizophrenia. They stay with that false belief. They might feel delusions of control, that other people are controlling them. There could be delusions of persecution, that people are either out to get them, plotting against them, conspiring against them, things like that. There could be delusions of reference, which is if you read a newspaper, there might be some hidden messages in the newspaper for you, secret code for you. If you watch the movie A Beautiful Mind, that's that provides some of these examples of delusions, which is pretty great. I talked to you about delusions of grandeur, and we talked about delusion of control. So in terms of disorders of thinking and speech, you could see loosening of association, which is where a person is speaking, but their thought is so disorganized that one sentence doesn't logically connect to the other. And it's more than just a tangent. So a person might say, I woke up this morning, the sky is blue, how's your family? I'm hungry. How about them Yankees, right? And each sentence might have meaning, but when you put string the sentences together, there's no bridge between them. There's no connection, right? So you might see loosening of associations. You might see neologisms, which a neologism is when you make up new words. And we're not talking about slang, right? Because slang, there's a large group of people who endorse that word. We're talking about you personally created a word that only you understand. So that's a neologism. Perseveration means to revert in an obsessive way towards a thought process. And word clanging, here a person might rhyme words off of one another. So let's see. The pie in the sky was so high I could fly. That's word clanging, words bouncing off of each other, rhyming nature, but the sentence makes no sense. All right, so that's positive symptoms. We also, I think I talked to you about these issues, right? So loosening of association, again, might be referred to as derailment. So the problem is insects. My brother used to collect insects. He's now a man 5'10". You know, 10 is my favorite number. I also like to dance, draw, and watch TV. So there's no kind of smooth connection between the sentences, right? You could see that there's kind of a bridge, right? Because the problem is insects, and you harness on the word insect, and then you bring it to your brother likes insects. Then you bring it another fact about your brother, 5'10", and then you anchor in on 10. But it's not how we usually have conversations. They usually flow on a theme, and then there are usually transitions between ideas and concepts. So that's derailment or loosening of associations. Neologism, like I said, is made up words. So it is an American law, right? American is not a word, right? Perseveration, like I said, might be repeating words or statements over and over. And then I talked to you about word clanging or rhyming that doesn't make sense. How are you? A response that says, well, hell, it's well to tell. It rhymes, it sounds nice, but it doesn't answer the question. How's the weather? So hot, you know, it's run on a cot. It runs on a cot. Doesn't make sense, right? So these kind of word clanging, it's about rhyming. Now, heightened perception. So a person could also be impacted by sensory input. And the most common heightened sensation are hallucinations. So these are sensory disturbances or sensory perceptions that really don't exist, but you're experiencing them. Now, when we talk about hallucinations, any one of your 5 senses, you can have a hallucination with. The most common hallucination is an auditory hallucination, followed by visual, and then the lesser senses as well. Now, if you are a clinician, you might want to understand the nature or the content of the auditory hallucination. So you might ask, well, you say you're hearing things that other people say don't exist. What do you hear? Is it just random sounds, or is it words? Is it, what are the words? Are there people or one person speaking? Is the person or people, are they speaking to one another? Or are they just speaking? Do these people speak to you? Do they give you instructions to do something? So auditory command hallucinations, things like that. These are all questions you might want to know when talking about schizophrenia and hallucinations. And then we have inappropriate affect. Inappropriate affect, affect is the outward expression of emotion. So that might be laughing at a funeral, right? That is so atypical. It's a place of sadness. The expected emotion is sadness. Why are you laughing? Kind of thing. That's inappropriate affect. So those are the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Now let's talk about the negative symptoms. Again, just like positive didn't mean good, negative doesn't mean bad. So negative means deficits. So these are aspects of one's functioning that are impaired or are lacking in the individual. So you might see poverty of speech, right? Or alogia, which is either a person says a lot, they ramble and talk, but it doesn't mean anything, it's meaningless speech, or they speak less, or they just become almost selectively mute in some cases. Now, we also see blunted and flat affect. We talked about inappropriate affect, but we also have something called blunted or flat affect. So blunted affect is kind of like a dulling of emotions or the emotional range, whereas flat affect is emotionless, right? So the person is kind of meh all all day, every day, right? So you might even see them monotone voice, might be hard to hear them. They might report lack of enjoyment or pleasure and anhedonia. The individuals with schizophrenia could lose motivation, right? Loss of volition, right? So feeling drained by doing normal activities, or an inability to follow a course of action, significant ambivalence or conflicted emotions. So that's important, because you see someone who's highly productive then just shut down, you might want to figure out what's going on. We also see social withdrawal, where a person who might have had a lot of friends retreat from their friends, distance themselves from their friends, and then this results into some kind of breakdown of, social skills. So this is hard. People can become very reclusive with schizophrenia. Now, we talked about psychomotor symptoms. People with schizophrenia experience psychomotor movements. They can have awkward movements, repeated facial grimaces. They could have odd gestures. They can have catatonia, and catatonia is an extreme form of motor disturbance, where either there's like wild excitement or erratic motor movement, or catatonia could be to the point where a person is frozen or statuesque for long periods of time. So, if you see people in weird or peculiar posturing, and they're like this in a psych ward, and they're like that for an extended period of time, you might see that as catatonia, right? And there are other forms, of course. So what is the course of schizophrenia? Schizophrenia usually starts to manifest in the late teens up to the mid 30s. And that's important because we see that when the stresses of life start to occur, right? So the common case is a person has gone to college, and now they're in college, and there's a lot of stress, and sense of uncertainty, and a person might have their first psychotic break at college. In fact, if you go back to the movie A Beautiful Mind, that's exactly what happens. But here's the thing, we don't always know that a person has experienced schizophrenia right away, because people suffer in different phases. And I'm going to say, even though we talk about prodromal, there's also predromal. Predromal is kind of before the diagnosis of schizophrenia, some basic, maybe some mood issues, some basic academic problems potentially. But the three phases that we focus on in schizophrenia are prodromal, active, and residual. So the prodromal phase is where we start to see the beginning of deterioration. We refer to this as where the symptoms of schizophrenia are fairly mild. And then we have the active phase of schizophrenia, and that's where it becomes very, very apparent. So you're going to see the hallucinations, you're going to see the delusions, you're going to see the disorganized thought processes, and so forth. Now, if a person experiences a psychotic break, most of the people who experience schizophrenia, if treated, will return to a fairly normal life with treatment. But there is something called residual schizophrenia, where a person moves back towards a prodromal-like level, where about 3/4 will have some residual problems. Even though you might not have significant hallucinations and delusions, you might be on medication that interferes with that, but you still have something going on. For example, some negative symptoms, lack of interest in social relationships, lack of personal hygiene, things like that could still show up in schizophrenia. Now, in the early phase of the disorder, it can last, or pardon me, each phase of the disorder can last for days or years, depending on one's level of treatment, right? So if you want to know who has a better prognosis, people tend to do better if they had better premorbid functioning. So before they started to show symptoms, they tended to do better, right? If a person, their psychotic features was triggered by stress, if we can eliminate the stress, they tend to do better. If it was an abrupt onset or a later onset, people tend to do better, right? Because it's a lot easier to treat. If people receive treatment, right? We talked about, people who receive treatment fare better on average than people who don't receive treatment. We talked about that in an earlier lesson. So let's try and understand type 1 versus type 2. I know you're familiar with type 1, type 2, probably diabetes, but we also try and make a distinction between type 1 and type 2 schizophrenia. So type 1 schizophrenia typically is dominated by the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. People oftentimes had better adjustment prior to the psychotic break. They tend to have later onset of symptoms and greater likelihood of improvement. So we talked about some of these features. Now, one of the reasons why people tend to do better with type 1 schizophrenia is because it's linked to biochemical abnormalities, so neurotransmitters, things like dopamine. So if we can regulate dopamine levels, that's fairly easy to treat based on medication. But type 2 schizophrenia is much harder. So if we were to think about it, it's the opposite side of the coin. People tend to have a poorer adjustment prior to the disorder, earlier onset. They tend to have poorer likelihood of improvement. And the reason for this is, instead of looking at the neurotransmitters or biochemical abnormalities, type 2 schizophrenia is related to structural abnormalities or brain regions. And we can tinker with uh, biochemistry, but we cannot fix an abnormal brain structure. We just don't have that ability. So that's why type 2 schizophrenia, people tend to fare poorer. And that is a very, very brief rundown of schizophrenia. So I hope that by the end of this lesson, you will have been able to understand, well, what is schizophrenia? It falls into the category of psychotic disorders. What is the prevalence of schizophrenia? 1% in the general population. What are the symptoms, positive symptoms, negative symptoms of schizophrenia? You should be able to understand what hallucinations and delusions are. You should be able to understand disturbances of thought content and speech and motivation. And you should be able to understand the difference between type 1 and type 2 schizophrenia. So that was a nutshell of what we covered. So once again, if you have a reaction to the video, please put it in the comment section below. I read and respond to all of them. And for YouTube algorithm purposes, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, click the notifications tab. That will allow this video to go to a broader audience and allow me to fulfill my mission of making psychology accessible to all. Take care, everybody.